Welcome to this new WiseL tutorial series on basic programming in Visual C#. This part of the series shows you how to get started in Microsoft Visual Studio, and we'll begin by explaining how you can obtain a free edition of Visual Studio called Visual Studio Express. We'll explain how to install that application on your machine, and also what happens when you start the application for the first time, investigating a few of the options you're presented with. We'll explain why it's advantageous to sign into a Microsoft account when you open the application, and also how you can view notifications so that you can see what things are new each time you open it. In terms of editing and configuring the application, we'll look at first of all how to change the startup options so that you can control exactly what you see each time you open up the application. We'll also mention how you can modify fonts and colours for various parts of the application, and very importantly, how you can work with various Visual Studio windows to control exactly what you see on screen. The last part of the video will explain how you can save and restore settings if you've spent lots of time editing them, and how you can also reset everything back to the factory settings if you make a complete mess of things. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do then is obtain a copy of Visual Studio, and for this video series we're going to be using Visual Studio 2013. Now if you do already have a copy of Visual Studio installed, there's no real reason you couldn't use that version for this series. So for example on this machine I have a few previous versions, probably a few more than I really need, but if I wanted to I could follow along with the series in Visual Studio 2010 as well. All of the code we're going to write should work in any version of Visual Studio. Do bear in mind that if you stick with an earlier version, then the interface will look slightly different, so there's a few more modern touches in later versions of Visual Studio. So as I say, I'm going to go for Visual Studio 2013, and I don't really want to have to pay for a new version of Visual Studio. So for the purposes of this video, and for this series, we're going to be using Visual Studio Express Edition. So if you have a quick Google for Visual Studio Express, you can then head to the Visual Studio Express website, and you will find various different versions or editions available for download. The differences in the versions available are mainly to do with the platform you can develop for. So there's an edition for web development if you want to design a website. There's an edition for Windows if you want to design modern Windows 8 or Windows Phone applications. The version we're going to use for this series is the one called Express 2013 for Windows Desktop. What this allows us to do is develop basic Windows Forms applications, and it's kind of a nice compromise between something that looks visually nice and something that's not too difficult to create in each video. So we're going to use this just for the sake of convenience. We're going to be focusing on the aspect of writing C# code, so we're not too worried at this stage about what type of application we develop. If you want to, by the way, you can still get hold of earlier versions of Visual Studio. There's still access to Visual Studio 2010 if you really like that version. I'm particularly fond of Visual Studio 2010 actually, I quite like that version. But as I say, for this video, we're going to go with Express 2013 for Windows Desktop. So you can find the download link and click it, and that will take you to the next page, which will provide you with what it is you want to download, or a list of choices. So what we're going to do is, in Visual Studio Express 2013, the current update is version 3 for Windows Desktop, we're going to find the Install Now link and click on it. Now at this stage, if you haven't already done so, you'll be asked to log into a Microsoft account. So I've already signed into mine. If you haven't already got one, you'll be asked to sign up for one. So sadly, if you want to get this for free, you have to at least sign up for a Microsoft account. But once you've done that, you'll be taken to this page where you can choose to download your selection. So I'm going to click on the download link, and that will start downloading the installer application. And when it's done, I can click on the little down arrow here and choose to open the file. It depends on which browser you're using, of course, as to how you access the file, but you'll have a little pop-up that asks you to open up, or allows you to open up the file. When I do that, I can confirm that I do want to run this installer, and then the installer application will launch. You can choose fairly bog standard things like where your installation will go. So I'm going to choose the default folder, Microsoft Visual Studio 12.0. I'm going to agree to the license terms, and you can optionally join the Visual Studio Experience Improvement Program. I'm going to leave mine checked. And then at that stage, all you need to do is click the install link, and that will go away and install Visual Studio. So that can take some time. So I'm going to install this on my machine now, and then come back and show you what to do next. When the install process has finally finished, you'll be presented with this final page which informs you need to restart your machine before you can begin using Visual Studio. So I'm going to do that now by clicking the Restart Now button, and we'll come back once that's been completed. So now that we've finished restarting the machine, we can actually open up Visual Studio. And we can do that from the Start menu, from All Programs. We should find there's a folder in there called Visual Studio 2013, and there it is. And we'll have a link to Visual Studio Express 2013 for desktop. So when we click the link, Visual Studio will start to launch. Now, the first time you do this when it's just been installed, it can take a little while to set up, so you need to be a little bit patient. Now, the first time you open Visual Studio 2013, you'll be asked to sign into your Microsoft account, just as you were when you chose to download the application in the first place. I'm actually going to avoid signing in just for the moment, and then when we have launched Visual Studio properly, I'll explain why it is actually a good idea to sign in. So for now, I'm just going to click the Not Now Maybe Later link and allow Visual Studio to go through the rest of its setup process. And as it says, this may take a few minutes, so I'm going to come back when it's finally finished opening so we can move on. When Visual Studio has finished opening, you'll be presented with a Start page, which is designed to give you quick links for getting started quickly with things like new projects and so on. Before we go into that in a bit more detail, I want to mention again this idea about signing into your Microsoft account. Now, if you chose not to do this when the application was first opening, you can opt to do it now using the sign in link in the top right hand corner. It is a good idea to do this if you've downloaded a free edition of Visual Studio. You actually have a 30-day period in which to activate the product before you're stopped from using it. So one way to activate the product is simply to sign in. So if I click the sign in link, eventually I'll be provided with the option to sign in using my Microsoft account. So I've created a mock account for this tutorial. It's called wiseourtutorials@hotmail.com. I wouldn't bother emailing it though, because I'm not going to be checking any emails in there. I've got a password, of course, which I can enter. And then when I sign in, this will activate the product for me, meaning that after the 30-day period expires, I don't have to worry about it being deactivated. When you're signed in, you get little notifications up in the top right-hand corner. You can hover the mouse over your little initials there to tell you that you're signed in. If you want to sign back out again, I can click the link here and choose Account Settings, and then click Sign Out. I'm not going to do that though, I'm going to remain signed in. One of the other advantages of signing into your Microsoft account is that it synchronizes your settings. So if you signed into Visual Studio on a different machine, for instance, all of your settings would be synchronized with the last time you used Visual Studio on a different machine. So we're going to remain signed in for the duration of this tutorial. Let's investigate some of the other areas of the Visual Studio screen. One part of the screen that's actually quite easy to miss is the notification icon, this little black flag in the top right hand corner. This icon, if I click on it, gives me information about updates to Visual Studio and other news items. So for instance, here I've got two potential updates. I can download my offline help content, so I don't have to be connected to the internet in order to see help pages, but I can also download an update to the SQL Server component of Visual Studio. If you want to dismiss updates, you can click on the little cross next to them, or dismiss them all with the dismiss all icon. And if you want to close down the notifications window altogether, click on the cross in the top right hand corner. Now, I mentioned previously that when you first open Visual Studio, the Start page appears by default to give you access to quick links for things like creating a new project, opening an existing one, and various links to Microsoft Developer Network pages as well. It also shows announcements, so recent developments in Visual Studio. You can see quick links to those by scrolling down the list. So I know some people find this quite useful and handy to have available. Personally, I prefer a slightly more streamlined environment. I don't like the Start page appearing whenever I open up Visual Studio. So when I'm developing, I actually have the Start page turned off. And one quick way to turn it off is to scroll all the way down to the end of it and uncheck the box that says Show Page on Startup. So if I close this window down, this leaves me with an empty environment, and the next time I open up Visual Studio, the Start page won't reappear. If I want to bring the Start page back, I can head to the View menu and use Start page, and that will make the Start page reappear. And if I want to make sure the Start page appears every single time I open up Visual Studio again, I can scroll to the bottom of the page and check the Show Page on Startup checkbox. Now, there is another way to control what happens when Visual Studio starts up, and that's to use the Tools menu and the Options dialog box. If you head into this Menu, Tools, and choose Options, there's a setting in the Environment category of the Options dialog called Startup. And on there you can choose what happens whenever you open up Visual Studio. Currently it's set to show the start page. I can set it to show an empty environment, which will be what essentially I want to do. I like this nice, streamlined, clean environment and choose what I want to do each time I open up Visual Studio. Other useful options though, if you're only working on one single project and you're doing that on a daily basis, you might simply want Visual Studio to open up the last solution that you were working on. So you can make it do that automatically by choosing Last Loaded Solution. You can also get it to show you the Open Project or New Project dialog boxes. But as I say, what I'm going to do is make sure that it shows my empty environment every time I open up Visual Studio. You can also control whether or not the start page downloads new content automatically, and if I uncheck this box, I'll stop receiving announcements on the start page. Whether you want to do that or not is entirely up to you. At this stage I'm going to click OK, and those are my startup settings set. Now the Options dialog box contains a huge number of settings for controlling the way Visual Studio behaves and appears. One of the things I particularly detest about this version of Visual Studio, maybe it's just me being fussy, but the menus are all in capital letters. I just think that looks awful. This was a feature introduced in Visual Studio 2012, and if I wanted to modify this so that the menus appear in lowercase letters, I can head to the Tools menu and choose Options. And in the Environment category again, head to the General section and I can turn off the uppercase menus in the menu bar. I can also do a couple of other things like change the default color scheme so that rather than having a blue background I can have either dark or light, but I'm going to stick with the blue theme. I'm not particularly fussy about which color I use, just about the uppercase text in the menu bar. If I hit the OK button at this point, I'll see what I think are much nicer looking, traditional looking menus. On a slightly less frivolous note, you can also change the fonts and colours used in other areas of the Visual Studio application. And of particular importance is the font that you use when you're writing your code, because let's face it, that's what you're going to spend most of your time doing. So if you want to modify that, or at least make sure it's set up correctly for you, head to the Tools menu and choose Options again. There's a Fonts and Colours category in the Environment section, and this gives you lots of settings you can change about any font in any area of the application. So start by using the drop-down list at the top, which allows you to choose the area of the application you're changing the fonts for. The text editor is the one that's used for code writing and various other things, but there are lots of other windows available as well. I'm going to stick with the text editor for now. When I've done that, I can choose which font I want to use, so by default it's set to Consolas, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but there are many other fonts available as well. You can change the font size, and in fact I'm going to do that now because when I start writing my code I want you to be able to read it clearly from the video, so I'm going to increase the font size up to let's say 14. That should make it clear when I start writing my code. Even within an area, within a window or a region of the application, there are different types of text you can modify the colours of. So for instance, if I'm choosing plain text, it's black on a white background. I know some people prefer to invert that, to have a dark background with a light font colour. So you can change that if you like. You can also choose different types of text, so if I choose selected text, that's what it looks like. Things like comment text, we'll mention comments a little later on in the series. Comments appear in this sort of lovely dark green colour. There are other things like for seeing errors. Errors are defined or shown in this bright red colour, also with a strike through. Now that seems quite a good idea to indicate different types of text in different colours, but the colours chosen might not be useful if, for instance, you're red-green colourblind. How on earth would you tell the difference? So you can choose different colours and schemes for all of the different types of text in a particular area. It's quite granular, the level of detail you can go to change these things. All I'm going to do is stick with the change in font size just to make it easier for you guys to read when I'm writing my code. And at that point I'm going to click OK. And I think that's all we're going to do in terms of setting up the fonts and colours. One of the main things you'll need to get used to in Visual Studio is the sheer number of different windows you can have visible at any one time to display different bits of information about your project. You'll see some windows appear and disappear automatically depending on what it is you're actually doing at the time. Managing windows is really important to keeping a clean working environment. So currently, because we haven't even begun a project, we only have two windows visible. On the right hand side we have the Solution Explorer, and that's currently pinned in place, which means it remains visible while we're working on different areas of the screen. On the left hand side we have a window called the toolbox, which is currently unpinned. What that means is that it collapses itself automatically whenever we're working in a different area of the screen. When you want to view an unpinned window, you can move the mouse cursor over it and then click on the tab to expand that window. When you click on a different area of the screen, like into a different window for instance, that window will automatically collapse again. If you want to pin a window in place, you can expand it and then click on the little drawing pin icon to pin it in place, and this means that if I click into a different window, the toolbox remains visible. You can unpin a window in just the same way, so you can tick or click on the drawing pin icon to unpin it, and then again when you click into a different window, it will collapse to the edge of the screen and then reappear when you click on it. As well as unpinning windows, you can also close them down completely. So if I click on the cross in the top right hand corner of the Solution Explorer and the toolbox, the windows disappear altogether. If you want to bring back any windows that you've closed down, the View menu is the place to go, and you'll get an idea here as to how many other windows there are available, all these additional ones, plus even a separate flyout menu for other windows. They couldn't all fit in one list. So if I want to bring back the Solution Explorer, I can either click on this option using the View menu. There's a keyboard shortcut sequence to use as well, but if I click Solution Explorer, that will reappear. If I go back to the View menu and choose Toolbox, that will also reappear. Your windows don't have to remain in the same position they are when you first open Visual Studio. You can move them around to your heart's content. So, for example, if you wanted to leave your windows free floating over the screen rather than docked to the sides, you could either right-click on the title bar of the window and choose to float it, or even more simply than that, you can simply click and drag on the window's title bar to drag it out of its docked position. So you can leave it floating over the screen and you can resize it by clicking and dragging on the borders and position it wherever you want. If you want to redock it again, you'll notice that when you drag the window around, these little icons appear. If you hover the mouse over one of these icons, it will show you where the window will be docked to when you release the mouse button. So if I prefer having my Solution Explorer at the bottom of the screen, I can drag it over this bottom icon down here, or in fact over this one here, and drop it in and dock it in that position. If I decide that I don't like it there, I could click and drag it again to move it back out of a different position and dock it across to the right hand side. You can resize the docked windows as well. It's also possible to dock your windows as a tabbed document, so meaning that it will take up the main area of the screen. And you can do that in one of a couple of different ways. You can right click on the title bar of the window and choose Dock as Tabbed Document, and that will make it take up essentially the entire screen. You can also click and drag that away, just in the same usual way, and drag it, if I preferred, drag it over this central icon here, right in the middle of the screen, and that will also dock it as a tabbed document. I can right click again and choose to float it or dock it somewhere else, and eventually I'm going to end up with it in the same position as I originally started. If you dock more than one window at the same side of the screen, then there's a couple of different ways you can make them fit. So if I drag the Solution Explorer over to the same side of the screen as the toolbox, one way that I could do this is to drag it over this extreme left-hand icon and dock it in place, and that will make sure that my two windows go in side by side. If I prefer, I can drag this window off and I can drag it over this, the next leftmost icon, and that will make sure that the windows go in side by side, but it'll make them half the width, so it takes up the same overall space, but still allowing you to have both windows visible. That's a little bit useless if you ask me. Another potential way, and a way that I prefer to do this, is to make the windows sit one on top of the other. So if I drag the Solution Explorer again, and I drag it over either this top icon or this bottom one, then the two windows will sit in one above the other. If you prefer, that can lead to awkward situations where you've made one window so small that it's virtually useless to read, and vice versa. So if you prefer, you can drag one window and position it right in the middle icon, and this means that you'll see the full height of one window, and you can switch between them using the tabs at the bottom of the screen. Again, if you were to unpin these windows, you'd see them sitting in their own separate tabs at the left hand side, and clicking on one or the other will display them. When they're pinned in place, they'll both be pinned in place when they're positioned like this. If I drag the Solution Explorer again and sit them, and this is actually dragged both windows now, you can see when they're tabbed documents, you drag the title bar, it drags both windows or all the documents, all the windows in the tabs. So I've docked that again to the left hand side. If I want to move just the Solution Explorer, I need to drag on the tab, and that will mean that I can position it. Maybe once again I'll stick it just below the toolbox. So when I've got it like this, I can unpin the windows independently. So one can be unpinned and both can be unpinned. So just to get things back to where they were before, I'm going to show the Solution Explorer. I'm going to drag it across to the right hand edge of the screen, and finally I'm going to unpin the toolbox so that it hides itself when I click away from it. If you've spent lots of time setting up the Visual Studio environment to exactly your preferences, you don't want to run the risk of losing those settings later and having to go through the process again. So to avoid that, you can export your settings so that they're saved in a separate file that you can re-import should things go wrong later. So to get started with that, head to the Tools menu and choose Import and Export Settings. If you want to save the current settings of the environment, choose Export Selected Environment Settings and then click Next. On this page you can choose exactly which settings are included in the export. You might get a warning about some things not being included by default because they contain sensitive information. And if you want to see what those settings are, you can expand the various nodes until you find which boxes are unchecked. So in this example, although we're saving information about the fonts and colours and the startup options that we changed earlier, we're not going to save the import and export settings, but that's fine, we don't really need to do that anyway. So click Next, then you can choose a location for your file and what its file name should be. I'm just going to very quickly change the output location to the desktop just to make it easier to find. So I'm going to choose the desktop and choose to save it. The date that's used is absolutely fine, so I can click Finish and all of my settings are exported. Importing some settings that you've previously saved is really just a simpler process. Start by heading to the Tools menu and choose Import and Export Settings, but this time choose the Import Selected Environment Settings option. Then click Next. You'll get the option to save your current settings or just to overwrite the existing ones, and I'm going to choose the second option here. I don't want to export what I've currently got set. Then I can choose Next, and then I have to choose which set of settings I want to import. So this is the file that I've just saved on my desktop. If it's not listed here, you can click the Browse button to search for it and select the file in the dialog box. I'm going to click Next at this point. It gives me a list of the things that will be imported, again including things that won't be overwritten, so this time I'll get little warnings about command window aliases and external tools alert, but it will include things like my fonts and colours and various other options that I've set in the options dialog box. So in the environment I've got fonts and colours again and the startup options. So if I choose Finish at that point, my settings will be imported, overwriting anything that currently exists, close the window, and everything's set again to my preferences. If you make a complete mess of all the Visual Studio settings and you just want to go back to the factory defaults without having to do a complete reinstall, then you can just reset all of the settings of Visual Studio. So to demonstrate how to do that, let me just very quickly make a bit of a mess. I'm going to close down a few windows and I'll pretend that I want to get those back quickly and easily. So if you head to the Tools menu, we can choose Import and Export Settings, and this time we can choose Reset All Settings. We can click Next. We get the option as to whether or not to save our existing settings. I'm not going to bother, I'm just going to reset everything without saving and overwrite my current settings. So if I just click Finish at that point, all the Visual Studio settings will reset back to their original state, and I'll get the windows back in the same arrangement, same pin status, and so on, and all the tools options that we changed earlier on will be back to their factory defaults as well. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.